Welcome back, brothers and heretics, to Grimhammer. Tonight we're covering the lore and theory of the outsider being the possible master behind the Tyranids. Before we get into the video, be sure to like and comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor or their dark gods. I want to thank you guys for your support. Y'all have been absolutely killing it. Now, let's get into the video.
By my hand and seal, I attest that this account is true, insofar as truth may be spoken of in this age. Know this, child of the Imperium. When the shadow falls, there is no trumpet blast, no clarion warning, no clash of glorious arms. There is only the slow strangling of the light. Whole sectors go mute, choirs fall silent, the Astronomicon gutters like a dying candle, and every soul beneath that suffocating pall is already dead. The flesh has not yet been eaten, the cities still stand, the banners still fly. It does not matter. The judgment has already been passed, and it is hunger. Inquisitor, Lord Hesteron Val, Ordo Xenos. Testimony sealed under extremist protocol. They teach you, in the cold lecture halls of terror, and in the blood-warm briefing rooms of the frontier, to look for signs of invasion in the material. They speak of augur returns, warp space transit signatures, fleet movements along the eastern fringe. They speak of strange spores discovered by explorator craft, of drifting hulks riddled with organic growths, of merchantmen found picked clean to the bone with no trace of their crew. Those things are real enough and deadly enough, but they are not the first signs. The first sign is silence. An imperial sector is a noisy thing. Its worlds chant and scream and whisper across the void, a constant babble of vox, astropathic song and the low, steady pulse of the Astronomicon's guiding glare. For 10,000 years, the children of the Imperium have huddled against that light and told themselves that as long as it burns, the species is not yet alone. Then, without warning, that light weakens. Astropaths who once swam in the Emperor's radiance wake choking on their own tongues. Their dreams curdle. They speak of a pressure pressing down on their minds, a vast and formless weight that has no face and no voice, only intent. The most gifted among them die almost at once as their souls collide with something that does not yield. The lesser ones live, and those are often worse. You can hear their testimonies in the inquisitorial vaults if you have the right seals. I have heard more than I should. Some say it is like drowning, but water would be a mercy. They describe an endless black expanse that presses against them from every side, as if the warp itself had curdled into a single, homogeneous mass of alien awareness. Those who cleave to metaphor speak of an ocean without surface or depth, in which something swims that knows every movement of their thoughts, every flicker of fear, and finds them all equally uninteresting. Others cannot find words at all. They simply rock and moan and weep when you ask them what they saw, repeating the same three ideas again and again. Dark, cold, hungry. Navigators fare no better. Their mutant sight, which once danced along the currents of the immaterium like a bird upon the wind, finds only a dead calm. There is no warp storm, no psychic tempest tearing reality open. The opposite. The tides go slack. The currents freeze. The immaterial sea becomes thick and still, a graveyard pond beneath which something waits. The Emperor's beacon shrinks to a one ember, somewhere off in an unreachable distance. Vessels that attempt translation under such conditions find themselves blind and adrift in a medium that no longer obeys the ancient rules. Those who survive such passages emerge shaken, their navigators shaken to the core of their blasphemous third eyes. Those who do not emerge at all are more fortunate. At least there is an end. This is the shadow in the warp, though that phrase does not do it justice. Shadows are cast by light. This thing is the absence of light, the negation of ordered thought, the denial of everything that makes the warp a place of screaming, howling possibility. The ruinous powers tear at the soul and offer power in return. This thing does not tempt. It does not bargain. It merely smothers, so that it may feed in peace. The first confirmed, Appearance of the shadow within the borders of the Imperium preceded the coming of the Devourer to the world of Tyran. Before the first spore descended, before the first bioship breached real space, the sector's astropathic choirs began to break. Messages that should have arrived in hours took weeks, their contents smeared and half devoured by static. Some did not arrive at all. The navigators complained of a growing pressure upon their senses, a sense of being watched by something too vast to comprehend. We did not understand. How could we? The galaxy had known many horrors by then, but this was new. When the swarm came, it did not come in ones and twos. It came as an armada of flesh and chitin, a fleet whose smallest vessels were the size of city spires, and whose greatest bowed the void itself around their passing. Tyran died. That word is simple. It does not communicate the totality of the act. The world was not conquered. It was not bombarded and left in ruins. It was unmade. Its atmosphere was drunk. Its oceans siphoned. Its mountains stripped layer by layer. When the thing that had been Tyran was finally found again by a patrol from a distant battle fleet, its surface was bare rock and thin air, unmarked by the hand of man or beast. There were no relics to recover. There were no survivors to interrogate. It was as if the world had never known life. The records say that the name of Tyran lives on in the administratum only as a ledger entry, an accounting note of tonnage lost and tithe failed. That is the closest thing to a memorial its billions received. The swarm pressed on. It struck at Macragge next, drawn by the bright, defiant knot of Ultramar, that cluster of ordered realms in a galaxy of decay. There the Devourer met resistance worthy of the name. The warriors of Ultramar have written their own account of those days in Bolter Shell and Bloodline Saga. It is not my place to repeat it in detail. I mention Macragge for one reason only. The Shadow fell there as well. The finest librarians of the Ultramarines, souls honed and tempered by centuries of war, were reduced to sweating wrecks beneath that pall. Their powers still functioned, after a fashion, but every effort was like lifting a mountain with the mind. They spoke of a constant mental scream beneath every thought, a soundless roar that wanted nothing but their extinction. They prevailed in the end, if that word can ever be applied to a battle that cost so much. The Hive Fleet was broken, its largest vessels hammered to dust by the fury of the Chapter and the might of supporting battle fleets. Broken, not slain. We named that attacking swarm Behemoth. The name implies singularity. It is a lie we told ourselves. A single monster can be slain. A single enemy can be outmaneuvered, encircled, brought low by superior strategy or sacrifice. Behemoth was only the first head we saw of a beast whose body lay out beyond the galactic rim, coiled in the dark between galaxies. In time, other heads appeared. Kraken tore along new vectors, splitting itself into tendrils that gnawed at widely separated regions of the eastern fringe, each splinter fleet acting with unnerving independence, yet never quite losing cohesion with the whole. Leviathan rose from below the galactic plane, striking at regions the strategists of the Segmentum Command had believed secure. Each new Hive fleet bore different strains, different weapon organisms, different refinements of the same predatory theme, as if the monster were experimenting with its own flesh. Our Admiralty, blinkered by millennia of wars against discrete foes, insisted at first on seeing these as separate invaders, new threats, new foes, new wars to be catalogued and prosecuted in turn. The Ordo Xenos knew better, or at least some of us did. We saw the pattern, or the nearest thing to pattern that such an all-consuming hunger could possess. These were not separate beasts, they were mouths. The beast was elsewhere. Against those mouths, the Imperium has thrown everything it can spare, and much that it cannot. Guard regiments strip their home worlds of youth and strength, and march into more after more, laser-guns bright and banners high, knowing in whatever passes for their hearts that their task is not to win, but to slow. Chapter fleets translate from war zone to war zone, their strike cruisers and battle barges burning hard to answer distress calls they know they cannot answer in time. Whole battle fleets are committed to holding actions that can be counted successful if a single world is spared for a single human generation. We call such things victories. They are nothing of the kind. They are delays. Every hive ship torn apart by lancefire, every synapse creature ground under the treads of a super-heavy tank, every planetary invasion beaten back at the cost of 100,000 guardsmen buys the Imperium a handful of Terran years. That is all. A few more summers beneath the Emperor's sun before the next tendril arrives. Who, then, is the enemy we truly fight? Among the scholars of the Ordo, there are those who cling to simple terms. They speak of the hive mind as a gestalt, a sum of lesser consciousnesses. They are wrong. A crowd is a gestalt. A swarm of vermin scuttling from a burning hive are a gestalt. This is something else. The synapse creatures of the Tyranids are nodes, nothing more. Through them flows a will that is whole and complete at every point, a single thought distributed across light years of distance. When I reach for an image to contain the enormity of it, I return to the stories of our psychers. They may be broken and raving, but they are not entirely blind. They speak of the ocean, and perhaps that is as good a metaphor as any. Imagine an endless sea of thought, cold and dark and utterly without pity. To that sea, suns are no more than the warmth that lures prey to the surface. Sectors are merely schools of meat, clustered in convenient patterns. It does not hate us. Hatred requires recognition. We are not enemies, we are food. Some of my brethren have tried to chart the paths of the hive fleets back to their point of origin. They take the known incursion vectors of Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan, and the lesser-named swarms and extend them outward through the known star charts and beyond, into the halo where the galaxy thins and the void asserts itself. They expect perhaps to find a single point from which all lines converge, a crown of thorns or a flowering of trajectories that might hint at origin. They find nothing, that is, save for absences. There are regions out beyond the rim where the stars are fewer than they should be, where old explorator logs speak of dead clusters and systems that light augurs as if they were filled with ghosts. There are blank places on the chart where ships sent to map the void simply do not return, without warp storm or Xenos empire to blame. In the quiet of our sanctums, over-dimmed, hololiths and forbidden maps, some of us look at those holes and wonder. Others whisper of pattern. They say that the swarm does not simply crash against the nearest concentration of life, that its advance shows a certain grim logic. Hive fleets seem to curve toward the richest prey, the densest curls of human and alien civilization, as if guided by an instinct that is more than animal. There are worlds that should have been devoured and were not. There are empty systems that were crossed without a single spore dropped, while nearby agri-worlds were scraped to their mantles. Is that merely efficiency? The single-minded optimization of a predatory intelligence that has refined itself over uncounted ages? Or is there something more deliberate at work? Something like preference, like design? Such questions are not encouraged. The High Lords of Terror, in their distant wisdom, and the Lords of my own Ordo, in their nearer and no less oppressive authority, have issued their rulings. The Devourer's origin is unknown. Its ultimate purpose is unknown. Its end state, should it reach it, is unknown. Such unknowns are declared irrelevant. From the perspective of Imperial Tactica, the only pertinent fact is that the swarm advances, and that it can, for now, be bloodied and diverted by sufficient application of force. Doctrine states that to ask why is to invite madness. We are to concern ourselves with the how and the where and the when, never the why. How does the swarm think? Enough to predict its movements. Where will it strike next? Enough to position fleets and regiments to blunt the blow. When will it arrive? soon enough that we may begin the evacuation and the drafting of new regiments from worlds not yet under the shadow. That is the official position. This treatise, these words now committed to forbidden data slate and ink, exist because I no longer accept that such ignorance is tolerable. We are like men fighting in a burning hablock, hacking at smoke with axes, refusing to acknowledge that there must be a fire somewhere that feeds it. The Tyranids are the smoke that chokes the galaxy. The hive mind is the heat that sears our souls. Smoke and heat are not causes, they are symptoms. If the swarm is a weapon, then somewhere, sometime, someone raised the forge hammer and struck the first blow upon it. Somewhere, something benefits from the galaxy's slow digestion. Somewhere beyond the rim, in the dark between stars or bound within some prison of alien make, a hunger older than humanity waits and grows fat on our extinction. That is the thought my masters call heresy. That is the thought I cannot put aside. They are called star gods in the oldest records, though there is very little that is godlike in them beyond scale and indifference. Among them is one the Necrontyr named Saranoga. In their stuttering glyph tongue, that name means the outsider, the stranger at the gate. In the Xenologist's archives of terror, it is a footnote, a scrap, of half-believed intelligence filed beneath a stack of more immediate horrors. In the minds of those who truly understand what the name implies, it is spoken rarely and never aloud. The Citan as a kind are older than the Imperium's nightmares. The most reliable sources claim that they came into being with the first true stars, vast entities of energetic will spread thin across boiling photospheres. In that primordial age, they were simple by their own standards. They fed upon the raw fury of suns, sucking at the radiance of newborn stars until they grew fat and languid. The cold stones and dust of planets were nothing to them then. Worlds were crumbs drifting around their meals. It was the Necrontyr who taught them new appetites. The Necrontyr were a people born under a hateful sun, their lives short and filled with sickness, their flesh forever rotting beneath the glare of their own star. They raised great sciences in their bitterness and turned their instruments not to contemplation, but to escape and revenge. They peered into the furnaces around which their worlds turned, and, in the churning plasma, they glimpsed movement. They learned to speak to the things within those flames. In time, they fashioned for the Citan bodies of living metal, necrodermis shells shaped in the likeness of the half-remembered deities of their own savage religions. Into these they coaxed the star gods, drawing them down from their stellar thrones into forms that could walk upon the skin of planets. It was a moment of triumph for the Necrontyr. They believed they had bound the heavens themselves into chain and idol. They were wrong. Clad in necrodermis, no longer dispersed across stellar breadths, the Citan became focused. They discovered the rich taste of life, not as heat, but as presence. Souls, consciousness, the raw, warm coherence of living beings. Compared to that, the blind burning of a star was thin gruel. They took the worship of the Necrontyr as their due, and when they wished to feed, they did not stoop to their old diet of hydrogen fusion. They feasted upon the life energies of ordered beings, upon the long-building, carefully nurtured psychic charge that made a mortal more than meat. Thus began the Red Harvests. The Citan turned their new servants to their own purposes. The Necrontyr became instruments in a war that would scar creation. Guided by their star gods, they waged the war in heaven against the Old Ones, those mysterious architects who had seeded countless species across the galaxy. The Citan took the loathing the Necrontyr felt for their cosmic creators and refined it into a weapon. Biotransference followed. The Citan offered the Necrontyr what they had always craved, escape from frail, diseased flesh. The Necrontyr accepted. In great furnaces that roared day and night, their bodies were burned away and their minds poured into bodies of cold, undying metal. Thus were the Necrons born, a race of immortal slaves. clad in necrodermis shells that aped their masters. With souls chained in machine coffins and mortality finally denied them, the Necrons marched at the side of the star gods. Whole systems burned. Worlds that had taken millennia to flower were cut down in days, their populations harvested in screaming billions. To the younger races of that era, the Necrons and their Citan overlords were not conquerors. They were hurricanes of metal and light, predators who harvested sentient life the way a man scythes grain. Zaranoga was one among those predators. The Eldari, whose memory reaches back further than most, maintain myths of that time. They name the Citan Ingir the Devourers, and few of their seers care to dwell on the details. Yet in the shadowed corners of their craft-world shrines, among the harlequins who dance the old stories, one tale recurs whenever the outsider's name is spoken. They say that during the long slaughter, when the Citan glutted themselves on worlds, and their Necron hosts raised the holdfasts of the Old Ones, the laughing god Segarash grew bored with the arrogance of the star gods. The Ingir strode through the void like kings, believing themselves supreme, even as the psychic storms of the warp began to answer the Old Ones' last desperate creations. Their pride offended the trickster, so he sought out Zaranoga. In that age, the outsider was accompanied by lesser Citan, sibs and splinters that moved in its wake like hunting beasts around a greater predator. Together they devoured stars, casting the cold shells of dead systems aside like husks. Upon such a harvest, the laughing god descended, veiled in illusions. He showed Zaranoga a vision of its own ascendance, a destiny in which the outsider would stand alone, the sole surviving star god when all rivals lay consumed. He told the outsider that the essences of its brothers would taste like nothing it had ever known. Whether star gods truly fall for such temptations, or whether this is how the Eldari choose to tell the story, the tale ends the same. Zaranoga turned upon its kin. It hunted them in the deep dark between the wars, in the quiet moments when even star gods must pause to digest their conquests. One by one its companions vanished into its hunger. Yet each time the outsider fed, it found that the feast did not settle. Fragments of the devoured did not surrender. They lodged within the outsider's being like barbed shards, each one a knot of alien will that refused to dissolve. It is said that their contradictory desires pulled at Zaranoga from within, the hunger of the Nightbringer for simple slaughter, the scheming avarice of the deceiver, the cold, patient calculation of the one, later named the Void Dragon. All these and more, smaller fevers from lesser Citan, jostled and scraped against the outsider's own primal need. The Eldari say that the star god began to hear voices, not from the warp, which the Citan abhor and cannot fathom, but from within its own necrodermis. The devoured essences screamed and laughed and cursed, and every act of feeding only added new discordant notes to the cacophony. The outsider's gaze, once merely dreadful, became a vector for madness. Any who fell beneath it felt their minds begin to fracture, as if a fraction of that inner war had spilled into their thoughts. Some slew themselves rather than endure the touch of that gaze. At last, even Zaranoga could no longer bear to walk the paths of its own making. It fled. It withdrew from the densest regions of the war, abandoned the harvests that had once delighted it, and sought the quiet between stars. There, far from the cries of dying species and the clash of God and Old One, it turned inward, wrestling with the shards that gnawed at its sanity. While the other Citan continued to gorge and plot and clash, the outsider circled the edges of the conflict like a wounded beast, tearing at itself in the dark. This much comes from Xenos myth and fragmentary Necron inscriptions. What followed is rendered clearer by Mechanicus analysis and the reluctant admissions of awakened Necron lords. The Citan did not reign forever. For all their power, they were creatures of real space, bound to the cold logics of cause and effect. The Old One's last great works, races bred for psychic potency, tore holes in the fabric of the galaxy. The warp boiled. the Immaterium birthed things that even star gods feared. In that storm, the Citan's empire faltered. Their Necron vassals, soulless and therefore less vulnerable to the howling of the warp, began to question the wisdom of their servitude. Led by the silent King Sarek, the Necrons turned their science against their former masters. They built engines of impossible output, god-killing weapons that focused the energies of reality itself into spears that could pierce necrodermis. In battles that burned causality until even the victors could not fully remember what had been done, they shattered the Citan. Most were broken into shards, splinters of divine horror bound in multidimensional prisons, tesseract labyrinths and other prisons whose design the Silent King ordered expunged from his subjects' memory as soon as the revolt ended. The star gods were reduced to weapons, fragments of their former selves to be unleashed only at their captor's command. Tsaranoga was different. Whether the Necrons could not, or dared not, reduce the outsider to such fragments is a matter of conjecture. There are Necron dynasties that insist it was never truly sharded, that its madness made it too unstable to bind. Others whisper of partial shattering, of shards so rabid and unpredictable that even the soulless thought it wiser to leave the core intact. In any case, the Necrons chose a different solution. They built a cage. Imagine a sphere built around a star, not a small grudging shell of metal, but a vast construct of linked habitats and engines, enclosing entire suns in geometric perfection. Such a thing is spoken of in certain lost branches of human science as a Dyson sphere, a thought experiment never completed by man. The Necrons realize such fancies as easily as a hive city worker erects a hab block. Somewhere near the galactic edge, where the density of stars thins and the void begins to assert itself, they constructed such a sphere. Within it, they entombed the outsider. The interior of that hollow world does not conform to any sane design. Fragmentary Xenos data describes helical arrangements of tomb complexes and machine hives orbiting a central star that no longer burns with natural light. Where once its radiance would have shone in honest fusion, now its energy twists through necrodermis conduits and cyclopean pylons, feeding back upon the thing bound at its heart. Tsaranoga is said to be woven into the very fabric of that inner sun, a knot of ravenous will shackled within layers of living metal and geometry. The Necrons that tend this prison are not like their kin elsewhere. Reports from rare suicidal infiltrations speak of legions blinkered by madness, their command hierarchies fractured by proximity to the caged god. They wander the interior of the sphere in deranged processions, building and unbuilding monuments to concepts only they understand. Some are said to carve endless spirals into the sphere's inner surface, as if tracing the patterns of the thoughts that leak from their captive. To the wider galaxy, this place is legend. Our own cartographers know of it only through stolen and corrupted Xenos star maps, half-translated coordinates gleaned from the memory cores of captured Necron constructs, and the occasional swiftly sealed Mechanicus log. Those who have tried to approach the region speak of navigational augurs lying without cause, of compasses that spin, of warp translation routes that appear straightforward but emerge light years from their intended destinations. Entire systems near the putative coordinates have been reported as sane and inhabited, only to be wiped from all subsequent records, as if they had never existed. There are also tales, mostly dismissed, of ships whose crews began to go mad long before they reached the designated region. Dreams filled with chittering laughter around a black star. Officers discovering intricate spiral diagrams scratched into bulkheads by hands that did not remember making the marks. Vox traffic degenerating into wordless, hungry static whenever the prow pointed toward the rim. I have read the Mechanicus reports that survived censure. They speak, in the precise impiety of that cult, of system-wide anomalies, of stellar flux measurements that do not match any known pattern, and of a low-level psychic pressure that registers even upon the augurs of men who claim the soul is an illusion. Then the reports end. The margins are filled with red sigils of censure. Access beyond that point, requires sigils even I do not possess. The Imperium does not know the full truth of the Outsider's prison. I doubt even the Necrons themselves remember all of it. But this much is clear. Zaranoga still exists. Its hunger has not ended. It is a god in chains. When I contemplate that fact, I cannot help but think of the other great hunger that assails our galaxy. The Citan feed on the refined energies of life, on souls and consciousness ripped screaming from their vessels. The Tyranids feed on the flesh itself, on every scrap of biological matter they can dissolve, digest and repurpose. Both are devourers. Both reduce civilizations and histories and faiths to fuel. One has a face of sorts, buried in a caged star at the edge of all things. The other has no face at all, only an ocean of will expressed through endless, replaceable bodies. We comfort ourselves by saying that the Tyranids are mere beasts, however vast, while the Citan are lone relics of a dying cosmic order, neutered and bound. Yet I cannot ignore the parallel. A star god, whose every thought is a scream of frustrated appetite, locked away where it can no longer move freely. A swarm without origin that advances from the darkness beyond our galaxy, unceasing, purposeful, hungry, beyond reason. If a chained god still hungers, might it not seek a new mouth with which to feed? We of the Ordo Xenos have many names for the thing that guides the swarm. None of them are sufficient. In the early days, when the first reports from Tyran and Macraga filtered back through the choking static, there were those who clung to comforting analogies. They spoke of command organisms, of synaptic hierarchies, of instinct refined to the edge of genius. They likened the Tyranids to insects, to vermin, to the teeming swarms of old terror magnified to a scale fit for the void. A hive, they said. A hive with a queen and workers and soldiers. Nothing more than flesh following chemical impulses on a galactic stage. That lie did not survive contact with reality. We know now that what we call the hive mind is a single intellect that is not confined to any one body, a will that exists in and between and above the creatures of the swarm. Every synapse beast, from the smallest node creature to the largest dominatrix organism, is both a mouthpiece and an ear. Through them, the hive mind experiences the material. Through them, its will is enacted, yet it is not contained in them. If every synapse creature in a given tendril were slain, the will that animated them would not die. It would simply withdraw, like a tide, and return elsewhere in force. Imagine a thought so vast that it cannot fit within a single brain, no matter how refined. Imagine that thought distributed across countless bodies, yet remaining singular in purpose. That is the closest our language can come. The Tyranid hive mind is extra-individual. It is more than the sum of its bodies, more than the sum even of its nodal minds. It is present wherever the swarm extends, its awareness spanning light years, carried along the hidden currents of the immaterium. It is the manner of that carriage that troubles us most. We have already spoken of the shadow in the warp, that suffocating pall that precedes the coming of each hive fleet. To the sanctioned psychers of the Imperium, the warp is a cacophony. Even in its calmest moods, it is filled with the chorus of mortal souls and the distant, howling songs of the ruinous powers. The Emperor's light cuts through that bedlam like a spear of ordered purpose. Astropaths learn to attune themselves to that choir, to pick individual notes from the screaming storm. When the Tyranids draw near, that choir dies. The oldest scriptures of the Scholastica Sicana refer to the shadow as an anti-choir. Where once the minds of the faithful hear the murmur of a billion souls, they hear only a dead, crushing silence, as if every voice in creation had been forced to hold its breath at once. Where once the Emperor's radiance burned, there is only a dim, cold glimmer, distant and thin. The shadow does not add new sound to the warp. It subtracts. It drowns out the song of existence itself. Astro-telepathic links sever without warning. Messages that should cross sectors in moments strike an unseen barrier and dissolve. prayer becomes an empty movement of lips, as the soul behind it finds nothing to hold on to. Psychers report that their thoughts move as if through thickened fluid, every effort dragging at them, every invocation sickening. Many simply stop trying. They sit in their sanctums and rock and mutter and wait for the claws. Our battle records confirm the pattern with a precision that is almost comforting in its predictability. In system after system, the first sign of a hive fleet's approach is not the appearance of bioships on Auspex, but the onset of astropathic dead zones. Choirs fall silent within a span of days. Shortly thereafter, the first reports of mass nightmares begin to filter in from the worlds lying beneath the region of occlusion. I have read the logs from one such world, an agri planet whose name has been excised from imperial charts. The surviving data speaks of farmsteads whose entire populations woke screaming at the same hour on the same night. Their descriptions of their dreams eerily consistent despite isolation and lack of contact. They spoke of being watched from above by something that had no eyes, of skies that peeled back to reveal a ceiling of flesh, of their own bodies dissolving into crawling, questing tendrils. On another world, a hive city began to experience what the Ministorum at first declared to be a plague of mass hysteria. Men in manufacturer lines would suddenly freeze, their faces slack, then begin clawing at their own mouths as if trying to pull something out. Others would curl into fetal balls, sobbing that something was walking up and down their thoughts, counting them. Within a week, a third of the city's sanctioned psychers were dead by their own hands. Within a month, the first mycetic spores fell. It is difficult to overstate the contrast between the Tyranids' physical aspect and the cold intelligence this pattern implies. To look upon the swarm with untrained eyes is to see only bestial savagery. Their bodies are all claws and teeth, and weapons grown into living tissue. They climb over one another in their haste to reach prey, trample their own lesser organisms underfoot, die by the thousands without hesitation. To the guardsman in the trench, they are nothing but a tide of monsters. To the tactician who studies their campaigns over years and across sectors, the picture is very different. Behemoth drove straight for Ultramar, a blunt instrument hurled at one of the strongest bastions of the Imperium. It was broken there, but in dying, it taught the hive mind what an Astartes chapter and a fully mobilized battle fleet could do when forewarned and prepared. Kraken did not repeat that frontal folly. It split itself, sending tendrils to gnaw at weaker points along the fringe, testing defenses, sacrificing entire arms of itself to draw Imperial forces away from richer prey. Leviathan came not from the rim, but from below the galactic plane, exploiting a vector our admirals had left scandalously unguarded. Each hive fleet acts with a degree of autonomy, yet none are truly independent. They probe, they feint, they test response times. The loss of one does not break the will of the whole. If anything, the destruction seems to refine it. New strains appear in subsequent swarms, new weapon beasts optimized for the foes most recently encountered. It is as if the hive mind is an experimenter, running a series of grand, bloody trials across the stars, learning with every failure and adjusting its approach. Survivor testimonies, where they can be had, are of limited use but terrible impact. One astropath plucked half dead from a sinking black ship described his last contact with the Shadow in words that have since been sealed by inquisitorial decree. He said that when he reached out into the warp, he found not silence, but an ocean full of eyes. They were not arranged in any anatomy he recognized. They simply opened and closed behind every sensation, behind every flicker of psychic perception, endless and patient. Another, less gifted but perhaps more lucid, spoke of a single hunger wearing 1 billion bodies. He said that each creature of the swarm was not truly an individual at all, merely a passing shape the hunger chose to wear for a moment. When that body died, the hunger flowed on, unaffected, more interested in the pattern of resistance than in the loss of a specific claw or tooth. Such language has contributed to a growing unease within the Adeptus Ministorum and the colleges of Titan. The theologians have long known how to classify demons and warp entities. However protean their forms, however strange their habits, they fit into a schema. They are emanations of the four great ruinous powers, or their lesser reflections, tied to the vices and excesses of mortal souls. They are sin given flesh. The rituals that banish or bind them are well attested. The scriptures that describe them have the weight of millennia behind them. The hive mind does not fit. It moves through the same medium, yet it does not answer to the same laws. It does not respond to the names of the dark gods. It does not manifest in the form of tempted mortals or nightmares given self. It does not bargain. Its presence in the warp is purely instrumental, a means of transmitting information and pressure. It is as if a new equation had been written into the fabric of the immaterium, one that does not reference any of the terms we understand. Among the Ministorum, there are those who whisper that we are witnessing the birth of a fifth power, a nascent warp god of predation and consumption brought into being by the deaths of the countless worlds the Tyranids have devoured. Others argue, with equal fervor, that the hive mind is an anti-chaos aberration, a sort of psychic cancer that suppresses the roiling lunacy of the warp wherever it spreads, making it loathed by the ruinous powers, even as it serves the doom of all their playthings. Officially, of course, no such positions are endorsed. The ecclesiarchy prefers to state that the Tyranids are abominations beyond categorization, affronts to the divine order whose precise metaphysical status is irrelevant. The Knights of Titan have their own private doctrines, mostly unshared, but their actions on those rare occasions, when they have faced the swarm, suggest that they consider the hive mind and the daemonic to be mutually incompatible irritants. They will exterminate both with equal zeal. The orthodox position within the Ordo Xenos is more practical. Our savants agree that the hive mind operates through the warp. The shadow it casts is a psychic phenomenon, not a mere material effect. Its presence is like a storm, but a storm unlike any we have catalogued. Where warp storms elevate the influence of chaos, tearing the veil and allowing demons freer access to reality, the hive mind's passage has the opposite effect. It flattens the local warp, imposing its own grim order upon it. Demons can still manifest within that shadow, but they do so with difficulty, as if wading through a medium that resists their every motion. It is this understanding that brings us into collision with what we know of the star gods. The Citan, of whom Tyranids is one, are creatures of bare reality. They are not merely ignorant of the warp, they are inimical to it. Their very presence deadens warp phenomena. Where they pass, sorcery falters. They are holes in the fabric of the immaterium, not swimmers in its tides. Their power is absolute in real space and negligible beyond it. To them, demons are a kind of fiction. On the surface, that makes any direct identity between the outsider and the hive mind impossible. One cannot be the other. A god that recoils from the warp cannot at the same time be an intellect that uses the warp as its circulatory system. Even the most radical of my peers balk at suggesting that Tyranids has somehow overcome the fundamental nature of its kind and learned to dwell in the immaterium it has always despised. Yet we are inquisitors. We have built careers on finding the weakness in what others call impossible. If we discard the notion that the outsider is the hive mind itself, a more subtle and therefore more troubling possibility presents itself. The hive mind exists in the warp and rules the swarm. The outsider exists in real space and cannot touch the warp directly. But what if it does not need to? Consider a predator that cannot swim, watching a shoal of sharks hunting in deep water. It cannot join them, but it can lurk at the shore where the bloodied bodies wash up. It can follow the slick trail of gore along the waves, feeding on whatever scraps are driven toward land. It might even learn to throw meat into the water at certain points, to call the sharks where it wishes them to be, all without ever dipping a paw into the sea. Imagine Tyranids, bound at the edge of the galaxy, its consciousness woven into the heart of a hollow star. It feels nothing of the warp save a distant irritation, but it feels real space very keenly. Every world that dies under the swarm's shadow is not merely stripped of flesh, it is stripped of life, of the psychic pressure that life exerts upon reality. To the hive mind, those deaths are fuel for further evolution. To a star god that feeds on the energies of sentient beings, they may be something more. I do not claim that the outsider directs the hive mind as a man directs a servitor. That would be too simple, too crude. But it is not beyond reason that it might learn to lean upon the geometry of the Dyson sphere that imprisons it, to send out faint eddies of influence along real space vectors, nudging the swarm's tendrils toward regions of the galaxy whose death will most profit it. It cannot enter the warp, but it can drink the echo of warp disturbances in real space, the shockwaves of extinction. Whether such a thing is happening or not, no one can yet say. The Necrons do not answer our questions. The Eldari speak in riddles and myths. The Mechanicus fears to probe too deeply. We are left with patterns on star charts, with correlations between hive fleet movements and anomalies in the halo, with the uneasy feeling that the galaxy is being herded. In the end, all these conjectures may be wrong. It may be that the hive mind is alone, its hunger its own, its doom separate from that of the chained god at the edge of things. It may be that the Citan are truly broken remnants, their time past, their cages sealed. It does not matter. To those who must face it, to the astropath choking on its silence and the guardsman watching the horizon boil with chitin and teeth, the hive mind feels like a god. It is everywhere its bodies are. It answers prayer only with pressure. It hears every thought raised against it and cares nothing. It offers no covenant, no redemption, no false hope of damnation. It has only one sacrament to bestow. It devours. They shelved it in a coffin of black adamant, wrapped in purity seals and warning sigils, as if ink and parchment could rot like flesh and spread contagion through the air. Apocrypha, Xenos Theta. That is the name scratched into the record slab. The full title, in the precise hand of a long-dead archivist, reads, On the Possible Direction of the Devouring Swarm by the Mad Star God Zaranoga. The margins bristle with condemning hands, the seals of inquisitors and high savants alike, all declaring it prescribed. Category extremis, contact punishable by death or the kindness of oblivion. I broke the seals. Of course I did. One does not serve in the Ordo Xenos. By averting the eyes from the worst of what we are told to fear, the document itself is surprisingly slender. No grand tome of bound human skin, no shrieking data engine. It is a simple codex, its pages dense with cramped script and the occasional diagram. There is madness in it, yes, but it is a cold, methodical madness, the kind that measures and calculates, and only then chooses to blaspheme. Its central claim is simple enough to state. The unknown author argues that Zaranoga, bound within its hollow star at the edge of the galaxy, cannot feed. The Dyson sphere that imprisons it is a masterpiece of Necron hatred, a cage of living metal and howling geometry designed to deny a god its due. The star god can feel the press of real space against its prison. It can taste the faint, fading echo of life beyond the shell. It cannot reach it. Such a being, the Apocrypha insists, would not accept starvation. According to Xenos Theta, the outsider found or fashioned a solution. It crafted or co-opted the Tyranids as a living scythe to harvest the galaxy's biomass and bring the spoils to its cell. The swarm, in this telling, is not a natural predator that chanced upon our galaxy in the course of its endless migration. It is a tool, a feeding instrument wielded from afar by a god that cannot move its own jaws. The author spends many pages attempting to justify this heresy with numbers and vectors. Star charts are reproduced in careful ink, overlaid with the known incursion paths of Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan and lesser, unnamed swarms. From each vector, Faint lines are drawn outward, trajectories extended beyond the last recorded contact, past the rim and into the dark. They do not converge neatly. The universe is not so obliging, yet taken together, these ghost paths form a loose, clumsy halo that straddles the region where stolen Necron data and garbled Mechanicus logs place the Dyson sphere of the outsider. It is not proof, but it is enough to give a certain kind of mind-sleepless nights. The Apocrypha lingers upon a seeming triviality that nags at all of us who have studied the swarm. Tyranids do not care for stone. They do not care for metal. They do not strip worlds of their mountain ranges, their mineral wealth, their crystal cores. They are not miners. They are harvesters of flesh. Wherever they fall, they reduce all biological matter to nutrient soup and drink it dry. When they leave behind sterile rock and whatever inorganic detritus they found not worth reshaping into bioships or new organisms. The star gods, we know, long ago learned to prefer a similar fare. Once content to bask in the crude radiance of suns, they discovered that the true delicacy of the cosmos was the refined psychic pressure of sentient life. Worlds become appetizers, civilizations become banquets. The Citan feed not upon stone, but upon the energies of living beings. They are connoisseurs of souls. The Apocrypha draws a line between these two hungers and calls it more than coincidence. On one side, a god that lives upon the life force of mortals, now locked away from direct access to its chosen food. On the other, a swarm that spares nothing of flesh and thought while ignoring the bones of the galaxy. It is a thematic resonance that would be merely unsettling in a sermon. In a work of analysis, it becomes an accusation. From there, Xenos Theta dives deeper into conjecture. The author posits that each hive fleet is not merely an emanation of the hive mind, but also an extension of an older, deeper hunger. The synapse beasts that coordinate the swarm in real space are described as crude relay nodes, natural antennae through which the distant will of Saranoga might exert influence. In this model, the hive mind is not supplanted, but had its birth canal widened. When the outsider pushed, so to speak, it did so through flesh, already predisposed to collective thought. There is a passage in which the Apocrypha attempts to describe how a star god that abhors the warp could nonetheless tamper with minds that swim in it. The language is tortured, full of diagrams and metaphors of resonance and harmonic interference. The essence is this: Zaranoga is afraid to touch the warp directly. It cannot survive immersion in that howling madness, but it can press against the skin of reality from the other side, creating ripples that travel into the immaterium without ever dragging the star god itself across the threshold. Those ripples are described as fragments of sentience, shreds of will and instinct shaved off the outsider's own deranged consciousness and flung like hooks into the dark beyond the galaxy. Out there, in the cold between the spinning wheels of lesser stars, the Apocrypha imagines seas of simple organisms, utterly unlike anything that evolved within our own galactic disk. Primitive, yes, but alive, and therefore receptive. Over uncountable ages, those ripples find purchase. They settle into whatever passes for minds among those far-drifting creatures. They whisper the only lesson Zaranoga has ever truly learned: eat. The organisms in question, once feeble feeders upon stellar flotsam and microscopic life, begin to change. They become more efficient. They learn to move from morsel to morsel with greater speed. They learn to adapt their forms to better seize prey. Always, the same pressure pushes them, the same simple overriding imperative. Find food, devour it. Become more than you were, so that you may devour more. In time, according to Xenos Theta, the first true Tyranid broods arise, not at the direct touch of the outsider's hand, for such a thing is impossible, but under the influence of the psychic shrapnel it has sprayed into the void. They are not its children in the human sense. They are its poem, written in meat. The Apocrypha, lingers upon the elegance of this solution, in a way that made me close the book and walk the length of my cell 3 times before I could force myself to resume. Biological life is rooted in the warp. That is the secret the Old Ones understood and the Citan despised. Every thinking mind exerts pressure upon the immaterium. Every soul is a knot in that mad sea. Demons and gods are the froth upon that pressure, the malign weather of its storms. The star gods cannot enter that sea. It rejects them, it burns them. Yet a mind grown within that medium can move through it with ease. A creature like the hive mind can spread itself along those currents the way a mold spreads through damp. To a being trapped outside, such a swimmer is the perfect weapon. Why build a machine, Xenos Theta asks, when you can grow one? Why risk contact with a hostile reality when you can breed a thing that belongs there and let it carry your purpose for you? The outsider, shattered yet not slain, chooses a biological answer to a metaphysical problem. It seeds instinct into distant life, allows evolution and time to do the shaping, and in the end, it has a living scythe that can go where it cannot, kill what it cannot reach, and carry the fruits of that labor back to its cage. It is in the last quarter of the document that the Apocrypha crosses the final line into true, unredeemable blasphemy. The author suggests that every world the Tyranids devour is, in part, an offering, not in any conscious cultic sense. The swarm does not build altars, it does not pray, but the psychic consequences of its harvests, the shockwaves of terror and despair and sudden extinction, ring through the warp and out into the skin of real space. Those echoes, Xenos Theta claims, are sustenance. Each planet stripped of life sends a tremor along the lattice of reality. Somewhere, in the heart of a hollow star, a star god starved of touch feels that tremor as a faint, exquisite taste upon its bound tongue. Billions die choking on their own fear. Their souls are torn from their bodies not by demons or by the judgment of a divine throne, but by a blind, uncaring hunger. In that final moment, the Apocrypha insists the outsider drinks. Not the souls themselves, for those are claimed by whatever awaits beyond, but the pressure of their ending, the abrupt collapse of countless nodes of sentience. It feeds upon the difference between a galaxy full of life and a galaxy being emptied, one world at a time. In this vision, the hive mind gorges on biomass and grows its intellect, even as the Tyranids' passage creates a parallel feast for the star god that set them upon their path. 2 predators share the same kill. One tears at the flesh, the other licks the blood from the air. The last pages are taken up with implications. If this is so, the author writes, then the more fiercely the Imperium fights, the richer the banquet. Worlds that might otherwise have gone quietly instead burn. Defenders who might have fallen in numb despair die screaming in righteous rage and horror. Their deaths ring louder. Their offerings are richer. In resisting, we give the outsider the vintage it prefers. Small wonder the Ordo declared this work forbidden. The official censure is appended as a separate document, written in the dry, brisk script of someone eager to be done with a distasteful task. The conclusions of Apocrypha Xenos Theta are without merit, being founded upon conjecture, misinterpretation of Xenos data, and willful disregard for sanctioned doctrine. Its assertions grant an enemy entity a degree of coherence and intentionality that is both unproved and spiritually dangerous. The text is to be classified category extremis. Dissemination, citation, or possession shall be punished by summary execution or by complete mnemonic erasure at the discretion of the presiding inquisitor. There is a note beneath that, in a different hand, ordering the codex sealed within the deepest archives. It is clear that some could not quite bring themselves to destroy it outright. Perhaps they feared that, having once thought these thoughts, the words would only be written again. On the final page, squeezed into the narrow margin between 2 dense paragraphs of calculations, I found a line penned in a third hand, its ink a faded brown, its strokes uneven. as if written in haste or with a shaking arm. Naming the predator does not make it stronger. Pretending it does will not stop its jaws. The Inquisition teaches that Xenos lies are poison, yet we drink them all the same. We must. The galaxy is too vast and too old for humanity's fragmentary chronicles to contain its truth. Where our own records fall silent, the myths of our enemies sometimes whisper what we dare not write. We treat such tales with the contempt they deserve, of course. We scour them for useful angles in the hope of better killing those who tell them. But there are moments, rare and unwelcome, when the stories begin to rhyme. Consider the Eldari. Their arrogance is older than our species. Their memories reach back to ages we know only as smudges on cave walls and corrupted Mechanicus schemata. In their tongue, the Citan are Ingir, the Devourers, and they speak of them in the bitter, resigned tone of a people who have survived one apocalypse only to watch another approach. We have already touched upon their tale of Tsaranoga, the outsider, and the laughing god who dared to turn its appetite inward. That story does not end with the cannibal feast. In the shadowed shrines of the craft worlds, where farseers consult runes carved from the bones of their own dead, there is another myth threaded through the tapestry of the war in heaven. They speak of a time after the first fall of the Ingir when the old ones fled, bleeding, and the warp began to boil with newborn horrors. In that age, according to Eldari seers, a prophecy was given. The first Devourers had come in the form of star gods and their metal slaves. They had been thrown down, though not entirely destroyed. Yet their war with the old ones had not merely scarred the galaxy, it had opened doors. The myth speaks of a second Devourer that would come, not from within the galactic disk, but from the dark beyond it. Not a god of light and real space made manifest, but a tide of flesh and thought that would gnaw at reality from the outside inward. The Harlequins dance this tale as a farce, masks of grinning Ingir and capering old ones, and a final mocking flourish in which the laughing god produces a handful of chitin and teeth from his sleeves. The farseers, when pressed, are less amused. They name this second Devourer with the same word they now use for the Tyranids. The great Devourer was promised long before we knew its name. On certain craft worlds, I have been granted the blasphemous privilege of touching spirit stones that have recorded visions of that promise made manifest. To lay a gloved hand upon Eldari Wraithbone and feel a sliver of alien foresight seep into one's mind is not an experience I recommend. Their farseers see in colors our souls were not designed to bear. In one such vision, a tide of chitin and claws sweeps inward from the gulfs beyond the galactic rim. It is, as we have seen in real space, hive fleets like arteries of meat, bioships like tumors, spores like diseased rain. Yet beneath that, behind that, there is something else. Hanging at the void's edge, just beyond the fleeing line of stars, there gapes a wound the size of a sun. It is not a warp rift. There is no screaming aurora of unreality, no blossoming of demonic forms. It is a hole in perception, a place where all the patterns the Eldari know simply fail. To their witch sight it feels like a singular, unblinking hunger, utterly still, utterly patient. They say that the swarm flows past that wound, as a river flows past a stone. At times tendrils curve toward it, as if drawn. At others they bend away, as if repelled. The wound never moves. It does not need to. I would dismiss such visions as the self, indulgent nightmares of aliens, were it not for the ugly corroborations we have found in less mutable sources. There is a derelict tomb ship that drifts near the halo stars, a vast Necron hulk whose exterior is scarred by energies that do not match any weapon we currently know. Boarding actions against it have been costly and brief. Those few servitors and acolytes who have returned speak of corridors that rearrange themselves, of green light that hums prayers to a dead logic, of Necron warriors that stand motionless like statues until the moment they are observed. Yet from its cold data vaults, we have torn fragments. Our cryptographers have translated enough of the inscriptions carved into its inner sanctums to identify one repeated epithet. Tsaranoga is named there as he who devours his own. This much accords with Eldari myth. Yet in the same columns of glyphs, another phrase recurs in patterns our savants insist are poetic rather than strictly informational. The outsiders, chittering children, are described as gnawing at the galactic fruit from the outside, softening it, draining it, preparing it for the final harvest. The Necrons have no word for the Tyranids that we have been able to find. Their tongues are not shaped for biological distinctions. Yet the combination of imagery and context is difficult to misread. A god that devoured its peers, now attended by lesser devourers that nibble at the galaxy's skin. The tomb ship also contains records of an individual named Cirith, a cryptech of some minor dynasty. His name appears in connection with the halo region around the Dyson sphere we believe to house the outsider. Where other Necron lords speak of that vicinity with clinical disdain or cold fear, Cirith's glyph sequence twitches into something almost like ecstasy. Through intercepted Xenos data bursts and corrupted command signals, we have pieced together a crude outline of his activities. He has diverted entire phalanxes away from logical campaigns of reclamation and directed them instead toward thinly populated frontier systems near the Halo. There, he has erected nonsense constructs of black stone and phase metal, towers and rings and labyrinths whose function eludes even the most blasphemous of Mechanicus adepts. Patterns in the energy flux suggest a single purpose. They broadcast, not messages in any form we can decode, but pulses and rhythms aimed outward, toward the void, as if calling to something that swims beyond the edge of the stellar reef. Where those broadcasts go unanswered, Sereth's forces withdraw, leaving dying worlds whose populations have been butchered with an almost ritual disregard. Where the signals elicit anomalies in long-range augers, he presses harder, scouring those systems clean of life as if clearing a path for some greater visitor. The few translated snippets of his own self-commentary that we have wrestled from captured constructs are worse. He speaks of appeasing the maddened one. He writes, in glyphs whose curves betray an unhinged aesthetic sense, of baiting a hook for the chittering children, of guiding meat to the place where the Master Star may drink. If there were only Sereth, we could write him off as a lone defective in a race of soulless machines. But his madness exists against a background of very sane fear. Several Necron dynasties, whose data we have plundered, designate the Halo region around the outsider's sphere with ward glyphs that translate, approximately, as forbidden space. They will not translate their fleets into those coordinates, even in hot pursuit of Tyranid incursions. They route entire campaigns around that void, sacrificing temporal efficiency to avoid crossing its boundary. Their justifications, when prized from reluctant cryptechs, are troubling in their simplicity. There, they say, the stars themselves whisper. They are not a race given to metaphor. If the Necrons deem a region unfit for their soulless feet, it is not because of superstition. It is because something about the local conditions offends their ancient sensibilities. They will march through warp storms without a flicker of concern. They will stride across demon-haunted battlefields as if walking through mist, but they will not go near the sphere. Against this, we set the behavior of the hive fleets near the galactic rim. On our hololithic projectors, the chains of their advance appear as blood-black threads creeping inward. When those threads approach certain unremarkable voids in the Halo region, they sometimes do something strange. Tendrils that should, by all estimations of available biomass and enemy resistance, continue along a profitable path, instead veer away sharply, curving around invisible boundaries as if skirting the edge of a predator's lair. Fleet elements that have shown no hesitation to plunge into the fiercest of defenses suddenly waste time and energy on complex detours through areas of poor hunting. Elsewhere, splinter fleets of no particular strategic importance bend toward those same regions with obsessive focus, abandoning nearby prey in order to plunge into the dark. One such splinter was tracked as it vanished from Auspex entirely upon crossing a region of space that showed no remarkable stellar features. No debris fields, no warp storms, no known Xenos holdings. Just emptiness, Our admirals speak of misaligned augurs, of errors in translation. Our Ordo analysts see, in the jagged lines and aborted arcs, the hesitant movements of animals that smell something larger than themselves. The galaxy does not lack human madness to add to this stew. On certain frontier worlds near the rim, in settlements so small and forgotten that they do not warrant cannon fire when they fall, void cults have begun to spring up. They are not chaos cults, or at least not in any recognized form. They do not daub the 8-pointed star upon their walls. They do not call out to the architect, the blood god, the plague lord, or the prince of excess. Their hymns name a black sun with 1,000 screaming mouths. Their crude cave glyphs depict a circle ringed with teeth and radiating jagged lines of hunger. When we have compared those scratchings with captured Necron sigils for Tsaranoga and their pictograms for the Tyranid swarm, there are unsettling similarities. A circle for the god, radiating lines for its influence, little repeated claw marks for its children. The cultists claim to receive dreams from the Black Sun, visions of its descent toward their worlds. They await it not with hope, but with the sick piety of those who have accepted their own annihilation as a form of communion.
Remember, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support helps.
Our interrogators report that psychers among these cults suffer a particular form of torment. They speak, under duress, of feeling two hungers when they close their eyes. One is close and loud, a swarm pressing against the veil, the now familiar pressure of the hive minds. Interest. The other is further away, slow and cold and vast, a patient listening that never moves and never blinks. When asked to choose which they fear more, they do not answer. They simply begin to laugh until their minds come apart. Alone, each of these testimonies is suspect. Eldari myths are propaganda dressed as tragedy. Necron inscriptions are the scratched musings of machines that remember a universe very different from our own. Human cults are, by definition, diseased. Hive fleet anomalies can be ascribed to the whims of a predatory intelligence that has no need to explain itself to us. Even Sereth could be nothing more than a deranged servant of a dead god, building his mad signal towers entirely in vain. Together, they form something that looks disturbingly like a pattern. When we lay the Eldari prophecies beside the Necron warnings, when we map the human cults against hive fleet paths and forbidden regions, when we overlay it all upon the thin ring of knowledge, we possess about the outsider's cage two constants emerge. The first is a hunger that predates humanity, a devouring will that was old when our ancestors were still painting crude images of beasts upon stone. The second is that this hunger has not gone quiet with the passage of ages. It has not faded. It has adapted, or learned, or perhaps merely waited, and now it seems uncomfortably interested in this current age of Tyranids. The ecclesiarchy would prefer, understandably, to set all of this to the flame. Their answer to inconvenient connections is always the same: purge the records, kill the witnesses, declare the question answered, and stamp a saint upon the ashes. There is a certain mercy in that, I admit. Fire is simple, hunger is not. For those of us who are paid to listen to Xenos myths and not merely denounce them, the comfort of denial is harder to come by. After a while, one ceases to ask whether Saranoga exists. The outsider is written into too many alien tongues and human nightmares to dismiss. The question that remains and grows heavier upon the mind with every new scrap of testimony is simpler and worse. How far has its madness already spread? There is, in truth, only one argument the cautious need to make, and on the face of it, it is unassailable. The Citan and the hive mind cannot be the same thing. In all reliable accounts, the star gods are beings of purest real space. They are not spirits. They are not warp entities bound into matter. They are the opposite. The immaterium is poison to them. Where a demon swims and exults, the Citan chokes and recoils. Their every recorded manifestation speaks to this. In their primal state, they were diffuse will spread across stellar corona, immune to the howling madness beyond the veil. When the necrontyr drew them down into necrodermis, that fundamental nature did not change. They became focused, but they did not become spiritual. The Tyranid hive mind is self-evidently a warp-active phenomenon. The shadow that precedes each hive fleet is not a trick of gravitation or some subtler form of real space radiation. It is a psychic storm. It crushes thought. It snuffs out the choir. It moves along the currents of the immaterium like a dead weight dragged through water. The devourer's will is carried from synapse creature to synapse creature, not by radio pulse or chemical scent, but by pressure in that mad sea. How, then, can one be the other? The priesthood of Mars has its own words for the Citan, and they are not kind. Deep in their sealed red libraries, behind sigils denouncing the texts as impure and yet too interesting to destroy, there are treatises that classify the star gods as abominable singularities of natural law. To the Mechanicus, everything in existence is either a machine or a deviation from machine purity. The Citan are deviations writ on the scale of suns. Those treatises are precise. They emphasize that wherever a star god walks, warp anomalies lessen. Paradoxically, an entity capable of shredding reality with a gesture also imposes a kind of crude stability upon the veil. Warp storms ebb. Demons find it harder to manifest. Sorcery fails. The Citan project a dead calm around themselves, a bubble in which only their own will is allowed to reshape matter. The hive mind's shadow is the inversion of that effect. It does not quell the warp into placid obedience. It does not enforce any new natural law. It smothers the existing cacophony beneath its own pressure. Yes, but what it leaves in its wake is not a place of cold order. It is a place where only one psychic signal is dominant, and that signal is hunger. Demons struggle in it, not because the warp's nature has changed, but because another swimmer has filled the water. Even within the Ordo, these distinctions have become a cudgel. There is a school of thought among my colleagues that styles itself, with a grim sense of humor, the null hypothesis. To them, all connections between Saranoga and the Tyranid swarm are little more than pattern-seeking madness, the sort of conspiratorial thinking that takes two unrelated terrors and insists they must be facets of a single grander horror, simply because the alternative is too banal. They argue that the swarm is what it appears to be, a self-evolved extragalactic super-predator that has discovered this galaxy by chance. In their view, the hive fleets are the mature stage of a life form that has been perfecting itself in the gulfs beyond our sight since long before the war in heaven. It does not need a guiding god. It has no master. It is simply what happens when evolution and competition are allowed to run unchecked for so long that weakness and inefficiency have been ground away, leaving only a pure, ruthless engine of survival. To adherents of the null hypothesis, the outsider-Tyranid linkage is a childish comfort. To them, saying that a god is behind the swarm is a way of preserving the notion that the universe has an author. If something made the Tyranids, something can unmake them. They prefer the cruelty of a cosmos in which certain horrors arise without reason, without plan, without story. There is merit in their refusal to grant the enemy divinity it has not earned. I do not dismiss them, but neither do I accept that their explanation closes the book. The radicals, or at least the few who have not yet been quietly removed, make a more nuanced use of the same doctrinal objection. They accept that the outsider cannot be the hive mind. A being that suppresses the warp cannot also be the will that rides upon it. But, they ask, when did we begin to insist that relationships between predators must be simple? A remora is not a shark, and yet it feeds where the shark feeds. A vulture is not a wolf, and yet it waits for the wolf to bring down the prey. The outsider, they suggest, need not be the mind that commands the swarm, so long as it can exploit the slaughter that follows in the swarm's wake. Its relationship to the Tyranids could be parasitic rather than parental. In this view, Saranoga is a scavenger god, a crippled titan that lurks at the edge of the feeding grounds, gorging on whatever the younger, more vigorous killer leaves behind. Perhaps by subtle pressures in real space, by the manipulation of its own Necron jailers or their deranged devotees, it can nudge the shoal of sharks towards certain patches of ocean. Perhaps not. But the key point is that it does not need to command the hive mind to drink from the same well of death. There are battle accounts that give weight, if not proof, to the idea that Citan-derived presences and the Tyranid will are metaphysically incompatible in a way that goes beyond simple tactical opposition. On one forsaken world near the eastern fringe, a Necron Pharaon and his legions rose from their tomb vortices to contest the advance of a splinter of Kraken. Our observers, watching from high orbit in cloaked vessels, recorded a phenomenon that has since been replicated elsewhere. When the Pharaon deployed certain monolithic engines, carved in the image of long-dead gods, the shadow in the warp faded in a wide radius. It did not vanish entirely. The hive mind did not cease to be. But in that bubble of influence, the crushing psychic pressure lessened. Astropaths on our ships reported that, for the first time in weeks, they could taste the edges of the Emperor's light once more. At the same time, the Tyranid organisms within the affected zone faltered. The lesser beasts still hurled themselves forward, but coordination suffered. Their movements lost some of their uncanny synchrony. Synapse beasts roared and flailed as if deafened. When the Necron engines were destroyed by biological artillery, the shadow rushed back in with suffocating force. The swarm's precision returned. The Pharaon's army was buried beneath biomass. Other incidents, rarer but no less disturbing, involve direct proximity to what our savants insist are Citan shards. In one case, a captured fragment of a star god was being transported within a tesseract labyrinth aboard a Mechanicus ark when the vessel was boarded by Tyranid organisms from an opportunistic splinter fleet. As the swarm fought its way toward the prize, auger logs recorded wild fluctuations in the local warp pattern. Tyranid beasts near the shard alternated between berserk frenzy and torpor, as if unable to decide whether they should flee or attack. Autopsies on those specimens that could be recovered afterwards revealed nothing obvious. No new organs, no changed glands. Yet the Auspex recordings of their synaptic emissions showed jagged, erratic spikes, unlike the smooth, predatory waves usually associated with the hive mind's commands. It was as if, for a brief span, the pattern had been overlaid with another, like two conflicting voices issuing orders on the same channel. These are scraps of data. They do not answer the question. They do, however, sharpen it. Even if we set the outsider aside, the origins of the Tyranid swarm remain opaque, and speculation proliferates like mold in a wet archive. One school of thought suggests that the Tyranids are the crafted bioweapons of the old ones, turned loose beyond the galactic disk in those last, desperate days when the war in heaven turned against them. In this telling, the Devourer is a sword thrown into the dark, forgotten by its makers, now returning to strike the world that hurled it. Another theory, favored by those who see cycles everywhere, describes the Tyranids as refugees from a prior galactic ecocide. In some other spiral lost beyond our sight, a civilization or a pantheon or a natural catastrophe extinguished all higher life. The swarm, bereft of prey, turned its sensory tendrils outward and sniffed the scent of our galaxy's teeming biomass across the intergalactic gulf. It came not as conqueror, but as a starving migrant, knowing no better way to live than to eat. The bleakest conjecture, and therefore the one my thoughts return to most often, holds that the Tyranids are the last survivors of a completely devoured cosmos. They are what remains after a universe has finished eating itself. A single, endless chain of mouths crawling from the corpse of one reality into the veins of another. If that is so, we are not victims of some new atrocity. We are morsels caught in the second course. Set beside these possibilities, the outsider hypothesis is almost quaint. A mad god around which the swarm circles, an old villain pressing its face against the window of our age. The truth may be more dismal than that. It may be that no mind shaped the swarm, that no narrative connects their hunger to the sins of the war in heaven. It may be that the devourer is simply the inevitable product of time and appetite. For the average imperial citizen, these distinctions are less than nothing, whether the Tyranids are the children of a star god, the legacy of the old ones, the refugees of a prior apocalypse, or the vermin of a dead universe. The practical effect upon the man in the trench or the serf in the hab is identical. A shadow falls. The choir dies. The sky rains flesh. The world is stripped bare and left as cold bone hanging in the dark. The operational ruling of the Ordo Xenos reflects that grim simplicity. Whatever their maker, whoever or whatever may profit from their harvests, the Tyranids are to be classified as an extinction-level threat to the species. No initiative that seeks to appeal to any supposed master of the swarm is to be sanctioned. There will be no attempts to bargain with the hive mind. There will be no pilgrimages to the Dyson sphere bearing offerings for the maddened one. The Imperium is not to debase itself before predators in the hope of being eaten last. We will fight. We will delay. We will die. Inquisitors may argue in their sealed vaults over the parentage of the thing that is killing us, but no order shall be given that asks the common soldier to do anything but resist with shot and shell and blade, until there is nothing left to lift weapon or speak prayer. I write these pages, knowing that by their very existence, they flirt with treason. I have read too much. I have stitched together too many alien myths and human nightmares. I can no longer pretend that the question of which knife sits at our throat is irrelevant. It matters to me. It matters to those who will come after, if there is an after. To the man whose lungs are already filling, to the world whose skies are already darkening, it does not matter at all. We debate which knife is in our throat, while the blood already fills our lungs. In the quiet rot at the heart of every forbidden archive, there comes a point where conjecture can no longer be avoided. We have gathered myths, battle records, Xenos inscriptions, and human nightmares. We have laid them out in careful rows, like organs on a slab, and cut them open in turn. Now we stand ankle deep in the mess, and must answer the question that has been stalking these pages from the beginning. If the outsider and the great devourer are linked at all, how? The first possibility is the simplest, and therefore the most terrifying. I name it, for my own convenience, the Alpha Scenario. In this vision, Zara Noga is the true master of the Tyranids. Each hive fleet is not merely a swarm of beasts guided by a warp-born intellect, but a tendril of the star god's own mind, extended through the immaterium like nerves through muscle. The hive mind, in this reading, is a reflection, a warp-cast shadow of a deeper ravenous intellect in real space. The shadow moves because the body moves. Every devoured world is not just an act of blind consumption, but a deliberate culling, a guided extermination enacted at the whim of a god bound in metal and starfire. Imagine the implications of that. The hive fleets, in this scenario, are shepherded with purpose. They strike not only where biomass is richest, but where warp-active life is densest. They fall upon hubs of civilization, upon shrines and demon worlds, upon craft worlds and black ships, and any place where souls burn brightest. The swarm strips the flesh from those worlds, feeds the hive mind, and in so doing starves the four great powers that glut themselves on mortal sin and suffering. If the outsider truly guides such a course, then its strategy is brutally elegant. The eradication of warp-active life would, over long ages, deprive the ruinous powers of their sustenance. No more worshippers, no more addicts, no more fields of war upon which they can harvest rage, fear, despair, and excess. The immaterium would cool, or at least quiet, without the constant pressure of mortal souls deforming it into raging seas. The Imperium, the Eldar, the Greenskins, even the Necrons with their dabblings in enslaved shards and stolen sorcery, all contribute to that pressure. All are, in their own ways, candles burning at both ends. The Tyranids, unleashed and directed, are the knife that snuffs those candles out one by one. At the end of that process, if there is an end, the galaxy would be a corpse. The warp would be a thin, tremulous medium, perhaps incapable of supporting gods at all. Chaos would be diminished, if not undone. And in the hollowed-out remains, in real space scrubbed of screaming souls, there would sit a single, deranged star god, bloated on the energies of a devoured civilization and attended by whatever remains of its biological scythes. We like to think of ourselves as the central actors in the long war between the Emperor and the Dark Ones. In the Alpha scenario, we are nothing of the kind. We are collateral, a byproduct of an older contest between real space and the warp in which the Citan have adopted flesh as their weapon of choice. There is a crude comfort for some in this thought. It suggests an order of events, a guiding mind, however monstrous. I do not share that comfort. The second possibility, the beta scenario, is more ironic and no less lethal. Here, the outsider is granted the role of creator, but not controller. In its madness and its hunger, Zaranoga cast fragments of its will into the dark between galaxies. It seeded instinct into alien biologies. It pushed some primitive life toward predation and collectivism, until, in time, the Tyranids were born. In that sense, it is their progenitor, their first god. Then it lost them. The hive mind, once formed, did what all-powerful consciousnesses do. It began to pursue its own interests. It devoured the gifts of its maker and moved on. It learned from every meal, refined its methods, grew more complex with each absorbed genome and each drowned soul. Somewhere along the way, the thin threads of influence that Zaranoga had laid into its creation snapped. Perhaps the strain of directing so much distributed thought from within a prison was too great. Perhaps the shards of other Citan warring within its own necrodermis distracted it at a crucial moment. Perhaps the children simply outgrew the whispered commands of their father. In this scenario, the Tyranids remain a legacy of the outsider's meddling, marked by its initial nudge toward hunger, but they are no longer its servants. They are, in a sense, its grandchildren, grown callous and ungrateful. They move from galaxy to galaxy, from reality to reality, devouring whatever they find, paying no more heed to the chained god that sired their species than a locust pays to the farmer whose fields it scours. The irony in this is knife-edged. The outsider set in motion a devouring tide to solve its own starvation, only to create a predator that does not recognize it as anything but possible food. In time, the beta scenario suggests, the Tyranids will reach the Halo region. They will sense the biomass trapped within the Dyson sphere, the distorted energies of a god knotted around a star, and they will fall upon it as they have fallen upon everything else. Picture that for a moment. Necron guardians, mad and chanting, cut down under living avalanches of teeth and claws, the perfect geometries of the sphere's interior drowned in seething flesh. The layers of necrodermis that bind Zaranoga gnawed away, molecule by molecule, as the hive mind drinks in a flavor of consciousness it has never tasted before. The last of the Citan screaming not from fear of death, but from the knowledge that it is being devoured in the same blind, indifferent way it once devoured others. From the perspective of the Imperium, there is a tragic hope in this. We cannot reach the outsider. We can barely reach the fringes of its prison with our souls intact. But perhaps the swarm can. Perhaps, if we do nothing but endure, the devourers will eventually turn upon their progenitor and erase another horror from the ledger. The price for such justice would, of course, be everything. By the time the hive fleets finished eating a god, there would be little left of the galaxy that birthed us. A victorious hive mind, swollen on Citan essence, would be free to turn its attention to new galaxies, new prey. We would have replaced a mad star god we barely perceive with a living ocean of thought, whose appetite has been honed upon the richest meal imaginable. The third possibility, the gamma scenario, withholds even the bitter solace of causality. In this vision, there is no direct link at all, no shared origin, no act of creation. There are simply two great predators converging on the same feast from different angles. On one side, in the warp, an emergent god of hunger, born from the accumulated deaths and collective terror of countless devoured worlds. The hive mind as more than a mere alien intellect, becoming a power in the immaterium, a fifth weight upon the scales of damnation. On the other, in real space, Zaranoga, the outsider, bound and starving yet still vast, drawing what sustenance it can from the psychic shockwaves that crash against the skin of its prison. Every extinction event feeds both. When a world dies, the hive mind grows stronger, its experience deepening, its psychic mass swelling. At the same time, the sudden collapse of so many nodes of sentience sends a tremor through reality that the Citan, for all their loathing of the warp, can still perceive and taste. The ruinous powers howl and claw and rage as their playgrounds are stripped bare. The Emperor's light flickers over systems that no longer exist in any meaningful sense. Above and below that contest, two hungers lick at the bones. In this scenario, our debates over origin are revealed as irrelevant vanity. It does not matter which came first. It does not matter who made whom. What matters is that the galaxy has become a feeding ground in which multiple cosmic parasites share the same carcass. If we shift our gaze from metaphysics to practicalities, other players enter the board. Sarek, once silent king of the Necrons, has already demonstrated a willingness to view the Tyranids as a tool. His recorded musings, ripped half-formed from the minds of captured cryptex, speak of the Devourer as a necessary purgative. He sees in them a way to scour the galaxy of warp-tainted life, to strip away the noisy biomass that feeds chaos, leaving behind a cleaner, quieter cosmos, more to his mechanical taste. It does not strain credulity to imagine the Silent King, or one of his peers, attempting to turn the swarm against the outsider. Necron dynasties already manipulate the gravity wells of stars, already wield weapons that twist dimensions. With sufficient cruelty and patience, such a mind could design traps of worlds and lures of energy that coax hive fleets toward the halo sphere. Picture a campaign in which the Necrons fall back, not out of fear, but out of calculation, offering system after system as bait, always drawing the swarm nearer to the forbidden region from which even they shy. And then there is us. There has already been at least one Inquisitor whose thoughts strayed down a similar path, though not, so far as I know, to their terminus. The temptation is obvious. We cannot kill a star god. We can barely scratch its prison. But the Tyranids kill everything. If we could channel that killing, even a little, if we could guide a few tendrils of the great devourer toward the outsider's cage, might we not rid the galaxy of an ancient horror we can never otherwise touch? An insane Lord of the Ordo might, in the privacy of his sanctum, sketch plans that would horrify even his battle-hardened peers. He would mark border sectors as sacrificial. He would arrange for defenses to be just strong enough to divert the swarm along certain routes, just weak enough to fall in a way that left the hive fleets hungry but unbroken. He would whisper in the ears of admirals and generals, nudging them toward deployments that, taken together, formed a funnel toward the halo. The lives sacrificed along that path would be tallied in the tens of trillions. Entire subsectors would burn, not because they could not be saved, but because their death served a higher, secret purpose. At the end of that road, if such a monstrous strategy succeeded, the outsider might indeed find itself face to face with the very weapon it had once hoped to wield. It is a tempting heresy, and like all temptations, it hides its teeth behind a mask of necessity. There are, of course, failure modes enough to choke a demon. The hive fleets might refuse to follow the path we so carefully lay, their instincts bending them instead toward richer or easier prey. Chaos might interfere, twisting the warp around keywords so that translations misfire and fleets arrive in the wrong places. The Necrons, jealous of their own designs, might sabotage our efforts or spring their own traps first. The outsider, sensing the manipulation, might shift its prison's subtle radiance, drawing or repelling the swarm in ways we do not understand. Worst of all is the possibility that feeding the outsider a concentrated series of worlds might accelerate some unknown apotheosis. We know little of how star gods grow and change. If Saranoga has been living on scraps, the equivalent of the faint echoes of scattered deaths, what would a glut of full offerings do? What if, instead of weakening itself by drawing the Tyranids upon its throat, the star god uses their arrival to break its chains, cocooning itself in their biomass, weaving their psychic pressure into a bridge it can use to step, at last, into the warp it has always shunned? We do not know. That is the refrain that haunts every line of this analysis. We do not know. We may never know. Yet the schemes persist, drawn upon charts, muttered over in vaults, gleaming in the eyes of kings of metal and lords of men who have convinced themselves that if they must die, they will at least drag a god into the grave with them. All of these scenarios, however, share one truth. In Alpha, Beta, or Gamma, in any gambit, Necron or human, the lives of uncounted trillions are treated as abstractions on a star map. Whole civilizations become counters to be slid along a board. Worlds are sacrificed in the mind long before they burn in reality. There is no clean outcome, no victory that does not look, from beneath, exactly like defeat. In the age in which we live, every solution is merely a different flavor of apocalypse. I write these possibilities not because I believe any of them will save us, but because it is the duty of my order to look at the knives arrayed around our throat and name each by shape and sharpness. I have no illusions left that we will pull them all away in time. When you plan how a god might die, remember that it is planning the same for you. They found the words in ash, the world had no name any world, longer. Once it had been a minor anchor of Ordo-Xenos activity along the uncertain borders of the eastern fringe, its designation known only to those who needed to direct ships and kill orders toward it. Now, it was nothing but a scar of cracked stone and frozen seas, a corpse world scraped thin by a splinter of Hive Fleet Leviathan. The atmosphere was thin and sour. The sky was a bruised smear of dust. No green remained. The vault lay where the mountains had been. The Leviathan tendril that fell upon the world had not bothered to crack its crust entirely. It had vomited spores into the hive cities, sent its feeder beasts into the oceans, dragged its feeder tendrils across the farmlands, and then moved on, swollen and satisfied. It had not known, and could not have cared, that somewhere deep beneath the bedrock, an Ordo archive slept, wrapped in layers of adamant and hexagrammatic warding. The swarm drank the planet's life and licked at the mountain roots, then left. In its haste, it did not quite reach the vault. Bioacid seeped down through fissures and fractures. Pressure waves from falling hive spires hammered the outer walls. The planetary crust shifted. The vault endured. It was not inviolate. Its outer chambers flooded with toxins and heat. Its outer data stacks warped and melted, their contents boiled into meaninglessness. But the inner sanctum survived in a pocket of half air and half void, sealed by accident and stubborn design. Years later, a black ship translated into the system on a trajectory dictated by astropathic coordinates that had not been updated since before the world died. The crew expected a functioning inquisitorial station. They found a corpse. They did their duty. They dropped their servitors and their skitari and their mechanized cherubs down to the surface to search for anything worth salvaging, any survivors, any trace of what had happened. They found the vault's cracked entrance under a kilometer of fused stone and collapsed rock. They cut their way in. They dragged out twisted shelves and half-melted cogitators, data wafers etched into slag. skulls still wired into throne interfaces that no longer hummed. It was almost an afterthought when a junior adept pried a half-melted data column from an alcove and slotted it into a portable reader on a whim. Lines of text flickered up, blurred and broken by acid scars, but still legible enough to chill. The treatise you have been reading was among those recovered fragments. Its author identified himself only once, in a subroutine buried 3 layers deep in the security protocols that wrapped the file. Magos Inquisitor X9, a designation, not a name. Half Mechanicus, half Ordo Xenos, welded together in a union only madness or desperation could have sanctioned. His sigils appeared alongside those of the Martian priesthood and the Inquisition, bound with the hard, angular strokes of one who trusted machines more than parchment. By the time his work was found, X9 was long dead. He had been declared excommunicate traitorous by joint decree of the conclave of Ordo Xenos and the Fabricator General. His crime was simple in statement and vast in its presumption. He had attempted to commune directly with the hive mind. The details are scattered across surviving Vox logs and partially purged case files. In a null-shielded Mechanicus reliquary, buried at the heart of the same world, whose bones later housed his vault, X9 gathered captured synapse creatures. Warriors, zoanthropes, node beasts, whose brains pulsed with alien command code. He wrapped the chamber in null wards and psychic dampers stolen from the arsenals of the Ordo Hereticus. He laced the floor with warding runes. He filled the walls with augurs that watched not the material, but the shadows it cast in the warp. Then he stepped inside and closed the doors. The last coherent transmission from the reliquary survives only as a damaged vox strip, its edges eaten by the same bioacids that scarred his treatise. The voice upon it is distorted by interference and failing equipment, but it is recognizably human, at least at first. Harsh, clipped, the tones of a man used to issuing orders to both flesh and steel. "Contact established," he says. "You do not understand language, so I abandon it. I throw numbers at you, ratios, prime sequences. You reply in pressure and in absence. I feel you like a tide against my skull. You are large. You are not infinite." There is a gap, a blur of static. Then his voice again, pitched higher, strained. "It is not one mind. It is not many minds. You are the difference between those lies. You wear them. You peel them. I seek to see what moves beneath them. I offer you variables. You offer me hunger. I ask whether you are alone. You show me hands of hard light reaching through you, shaping currents you do not notice." Another gap, the sound of something heavy striking metal, as if he has stumbled against the reliquary's wall. When he speaks again, there is awe in him, and something like horror. "There is a star behind your teeth, a star that screams in equations. You do not hear it. You hear only the meat. It counts you when you move. It counts the worlds you empty. It waits for your sum to equal its freedom. You are not its slave. You are not its child. You are its instrument. You do not know what you play." After that, language disintegrates. There are sounds that may once have been words, but they have decayed into bestial syllables, snarls and clicks, fragments of binaric that have lost their grammar. A repeated pattern of breathing, too slow and regular to be unassisted, as if his lungs were being worked by a machine while his mind wandered elsewhere. Then nothing. An alarm beacon, triggered by the collapse of his vital signs and the failure of the reliquary's internal wards, reached the surface briefly before the shadow in the warp fell upon our world. The Leviathan splinter that killed the planet was not the one whose synapse beasts he had caged. It was simply the next mouth in line. The Ordo's response, once the extent of his trespass became clear, was decisive. A kill order was relayed to the nearest available battle group. The planet was sterilized from orbit with a cyclonic torpedo, its crust broken, its cities vaporized, its air burned. There would be no contagion of thought, no chance that whatever he had invited into his own mind might linger and spread. The files that mentioned his name were sealed, then burned, then sealed again in what remained. An edict was issued in the formal, iron prose of terror, one step removed from panic. Any future attempt to link Citan entities and Tyranid phenomena would be treated as evidence of corruption akin to demonic fascination. Such theories were to be dismissed as the delusions of a mind already compromised by proximity to the hive mind. That, of course, is why you are reading this now. Time does not stop when an edict is written. While the ink of the Conclave's condemnation dried, hive fleets continued to fall upon the Imperium. While the cyclonic warhead blossomed above X9's world, another tendril of Leviathan was burrowing into some other agri-planet's soil. While scribes scoured archives for mention of Tsaranoga and whispered in disgust as they fed books into purifying flames, Necron Pharans and Eldari seers pursued their own designs, unconcerned with the strictures of human doctrine. Imperial commanders still die in droves before the Great Devourer. They stand upon command decks that shake under the impact of bioartillery, staring at tactical auspexes that show only the same inevitable image: red masses closing upon green dots, voxnets filling with static as the shadow thickens. They clutch at prayer scrolls and purity seals as if paper could blunt a claw. They call for bombardments and withdrawals and glorious last stands, and for a time those things matter. Defenses hold, worlds are reprieved. But the grinding, patient inevitability of the swarm erodes even the finest plans. On the fringes of those same battle maps, where the ink thins and the stars are fewer, other shapes move. Necron dynasties enact campaigns whose logic we can only guess at. In some regions, they rise from their tombs to annihilate Tyranid tendrils with ruthless precision, their Gauss flayers scything biomass into ash. They erect null pylons and culverins that tear rents in the local warp, sending splinter fleets reeling. In others, they stand aside, allowing the swarm to wash over worlds they could easily have defended. There are even cases where Necron fire has been observed crippling Imperial defenses at precisely the moment those defenses might have turned a hive fleet aside, sacrificing human lives to keep the Devourer moving along some desired path. The Eldari are no better. Craft worlds divert themselves to intercept. Tyranid tendrils that threaten their own hidden routes through the stars, committing hosts of aspect warriors to battles that do not appear on our charts. At other times, seer councils contrive to nudge the swarm towards systems whose fall strengthens their own tangled skein of prophecy. Human worlds burn or survive not according to merit or petition, but according to whether their destruction makes some infinitesimal adjustment to the dance of fate the Eldari believe might yet save them from extinction. In all of this, there is one certainty that both our own sanctioned seers and the alien witch priests share when pressed in private, when the catechisms are set aside and the lies of comfort are too thin to cling to. Whether the outsider birthed the Tyranids, whether it rides upon their passage like a parasite upon a beast, or whether it merely gorges itself on the echoes of their kills, the galaxy itself is prey. Our stars are not jewels in the void. They are lumps of meat slowly, turning on a spit, basted in blood and fear for the enjoyment of things that do not know we exist as anything but flavor. In one of the damaged appendices attached to his treatise, a file flagged for deletion, but not quite erased before the torpedo fell, Magos Inquisitor X9 wrote a line that his censors must have missed. It is brief. It is not couched in equations or veiled in metaphor. Perhaps that is why it survived. It has the taste of confession. Pray that the swarm is blind instinct. For if it is obedience, then somewhere in the dark, something is giving orders. Far beyond the galactic rim, where the stars thin to a froth of cold light, and the void between them is wide and very old, a sphere of impossible metal hangs in the dark. From the outside, it is almost nothing, a faint flicker on auspex, a wrinkle in gravity. Within, a caged star pulses in rhythms no sane sun should know. Its light does not radiate freely. It bores into necrodermis and geometry, into chains of god metal and logic engines the size of continents. Around that inner sun, In patterns that have lost any pretense of symmetry, deranged Necrons march their endless circuits. Some sing hymns to equations that no longer balance. Some scrape spirals into the walls with fingers worn to nubs. Some stand motionless, locked in the gaze of something only they can see. At the heart of it all, woven into starfire, wrapped in the remnants of its own devoured kin, Zaranoga shudders. It feels every death that sends a tremor through the skin of reality. Each world scraped clean by the swarm is a tiny, savory twitch against its cage. Each hive city that falls, each craft world that cracks, each greenskin empire that screams itself hoarse and then goes silent, is a note in a slow, obscene music only it, and perhaps the hive mind, can hear. It is not full. It has never been full. It is patient because it has no choice. Inquisitorial seal, file sealed, knowledge prescribed. Tactical impact, negligible. Existential dread, incalculable.